What if blindness wasn't the end of sight, but the beginning of a vision no human should carry? The wind over the Balkan plains was merciless that day. A dust storm so fierce it swallowed the horizon tore through a small village in Bulgaria. When it passed, a 12-year-old girl named Vangelia was found half-buried, trembling, her eyes filled with sand and light. She would never see again. Yet from that moment, she began to see everything. They called her Baba Vanga, the grandmother of vision. To her neighbors, she was a simple healer who murmured prayers over water. To those who traveled across borders to find her, she was a living oracle. Soldiers, scientists, and even prime ministers stood in the line that curled before her home. She would touch their hands, tilt her head slightly, and speak of wars, deaths, and victories not yet written. She spoke of metal birds striking tall towers in a land across the ocean. She saw waves higher than mountains swallowing villages in the east. She whispered of a black-skinned leader who would rise over a powerful white nation. Years later, when the world remembered her words, they said she had been right every time. But the prophecies that haunt our century were not about the past. They were about a future she called the season of judgment, the era when the eagle would wound itself. In her cryptic language, the eagle was America, the land of freedom that would one day turn its wings inward. And at the center of that storm, she saw a man whose fate would bind to the nation's own. She said he would not come from politics but from gold and commerce. He would tower over others, surrounded by wealth, pride, and controversy. A man loved by half, despised by half, yet destined to divide and awaken a sleeping empire. Decades before his name filled headlines, Baba Vanga had described him in chilling detail. To many who heard these words, it seemed impossible. How could a blind mystic born in 1911 foresee the rise of a billionaire businessman turned world leader? How could she know of an era when nations would tremble at their own reflection? Yet the more the decades passed, the more her puzzle pieces began to fit. When Donald Trump emerged as a figure of immense influence, a builder, an entertainer, and finally a president, the parallels grew undeniable. And as the storms of impeachment, indictment, and division raged, her voice seemed to echo from another time. He will face exile and return. He will be tested by the fire of his own people. Still, Baba Vanga's visions were never single-layered. Behind every event, she saw a spiritual mirror. She warned that her prophecies were not punishments, but patterns, cycles that repeat until humanity learns to see. She said the century would end as it began, with blindness. But this time it would not be of eyes, but of truth. If you listen carefully to her recorded words, now old and fragile, you can hear the fatigue in her breath when she says, "People will ask for signs, but they will not recognize them when they come." The world, she believed, would mistake revelation for chaos, and that blindness would be the true disaster of our age. For Baba Vanga, 2026 was never just a date. It was a crossing, a year when humanity would stand at the threshold between reason and ruin, when the old world would crumble not by war, but by division. And before the flood of information and noise could drown every whisper of truth, she left behind a final warning. Only those who see through the dust will survive the storm. Today, as nations fracture under weight of their own certainty, and leaders are both worshipped and condemned in the same breath, her words linger like the echo of a storm that never truly passed. The dust may have blinded her eyes, but perhaps it also unveiled a glimpse of ours. If you've ever felt that the world is spinning toward something immense, something unseen yet inevitable, stay close. Because the storm Baba Vanga saw has only just begun to gather. And in its eye stands a man made of gold, one whose destiny might decide not only America's fate, but the fate of every soul that still believes sight and vision are the same thing. He was the man she called the Golden One, not because of his hair or the towers he would build, but because of the light and shadow that gold represents, the twin powers of creation and corruption. To Baba Vanga, gold was never just wealth. It was temptation, destiny, and the mirror through which power sees itself. She said that in the final decades before the Great Fracturing, a leader would rise from the world of gold and commerce, not born of politics, but of ambition. He would not kneel to tradition. He would not speak the language of the old order. And because of that, the world would love him and hate him in equal measure. When Donald Trump descended the golden escalator in 2015, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, the prophecy found its shape. He came as the disruptor, the builder who claimed to fix what politicians had broken. Few realized then that his ascent had already been written in a whisper from the Balkans, nearly half a century earlier. Baba Vanga described this leader as a man of paradox, a figure who could both awaken and divide, one who would win against every prediction, fall into disgrace, and yet rise again. She warned that his life would mirror the fate of his nation, that as he rose, so would its pride, as he fell, so would its unity. He will stand before the temple of judgment, she said, and the stones will shout against him. Think about the past decade. The investigations, the impeachments, the endless trials in the court of public opinion. No matter the verdict, each episode seemed to follow her outline exactly. A leader encircled, yet unbroken. A storm fed by both devotion and fury. The more his enemies sought to destroy him, the stronger his shadow became. But Baba Vanga's prophecy went beyond politics. She said the Golden Man-ass story would mark the moment when America looked into its own soul and could no longer recognize itself. He will be the mirror, she said. Those who gaze at him will see themselves, and they will not like what they find. Perhaps that's what we're witnessing now, a nation no longer fighting over ideas but reflections. Neighbors turning on neighbors, not because they differ in belief, but because the mirror has become unbearable to look at. Baba Vanga saw this polarization as the first tremor of a greater quake. She spoke of a house divided that will not fall in one blow, but crack slowly from within. She called it the Great Fracturing, the moment when unity would crumble under the weight of ideology and ego. She saw protests rising like tides, voices demanding justice, while justice itself became unrecognizable. Yet through that chaos, she saw the Golden Man standing still, surrounded by fire yet untouched, not because he was innocent, but because the flames were meant for the structure itself, the empire, not the man. He will walk through trials of iron and word, she warned, and from his persecution, a new age will begin. The curious part of her prophecy is the idea of exile and return. She said he would fall from grace, wander the wilderness of disgrace and lawsuits, and then, at the appointed hour, step back into power. Not necessarily through office, but through influence. His voice, she said, would become a banner for those who feel silenced, and his reappearance would coincide with the year of reckoning, 2026. It's strange how the timelines align. The political calendar, the social unrest, the deepening divide. You can feel it in the air, can't you? That sense of inevitability, as if history has been rehearsing this moment. Baba Vanga described this era as the turning of the wheel, where what was hidden becomes visible, and the architects of illusion lose their grip. She did not call him a savior or a destroyer. She called him a catalyst, the one through whom the hidden fault lines would finally reveal themselves. And she warned that the people would not understand this until it was too late. They will curse him for the fire, she said, but the fire will not come from him, it will come through him. Whether by chance or design, her words now feel less like a myth and more like a mirror to our own headlines. Each indictment, each protest, each rally echoes a script already foretold, as if history itself were trying to remind us that prophecy doesn't need to predict the future. It only needs to reveal the pattern. Still, Baba Vanga's most unsettling insight wasn't about the Golden Man's triumph, but his solitude. She foresaw him standing alone, surrounded by betrayal, encircled by those who once called him ally. She said he would learn the most ancient truth of power, that no throne is ever truly shared. In that solitude, she saw the nation's reflection again. As he is judged, she said, so shall the land be judged. And from that judgment, two paths would appear, one of rebellion, one of rebirth. But only one would survive the storm of 2026. It's not difficult to imagine how the pieces could fall into place. The economy trembling, the currency weakening, the people exhausted by endless outrage. In that moment of collective fatigue, the world would look for light and find only reflections of gold. So perhaps the real question isn't whether Baba Vanga saw Donald Trump's return. Perhaps it's whether she saw ours, the return of humanity to its own crossroads, once again choosing between unity and division, truth and illusion. She once whispered, "Gold will shine brightest before it burns." And as the fires of politics and prophecy merge, we are left to wonder, is that shine the beginning of light or the final glow before the fall? She said there would come a year when the eagle would no longer fly straight, when its wings would turn against themselves and the sky would tremble with smoke. She called it the Great Fracturing. In her visions, it began not with bombs or invasions, but with disbelief. Neighbors doubting neighbors, leaders doubting truth, and nations doubting their own reflection. That year, she said, would be 2026. The same year when the golden man's exile would end, and the world would face its reckoning. To her, it was the moment when division would cease to be political and become spiritual. The line between light and shadow would no longer run between parties or nations, but through the human heart itself. Baba Vanga spoke of crowds flooding the streets, of cities burning with anger, and of words sharper than bullets. She said America, the land of the eagle, would tremble, not from foreign invaders, but from within. She saw its unity fracture like glass, struck by a silent hammer. And from those fractures, she said, two Americas would emerge. In one, there would be the rule of control, surveillance, obedience, and fear. In the other, rebellion and awakening, people turning inward for truth rather than upward for orders. She called it the separation of the wings. The great symbol of liberty, she warned, would twist inward until its own claws met in conflict. At first, her listeners thought she spoke of politics, of civil war. But the deeper she went, the more it became clear she was describing something larger, a collapse of meaning itself. When lies become air, the world will forget how to breathe, she said. If you look around today, it feels uncomfortably close. Inflation eats through savings, trust in government, in media, in institutions, all dissolving. The nation's heartbeat now measured not in unity, but in outrage. Baba Vanga's words echo as headlines. Deaths at record highs, protests growing louder, allies drifting away, old enemies aligning under new banners. But the great fracturing, she said, would not end with politics or economics. It would reach into the earth itself. The planet would answer humanity's blindness with its own rebellion. The earth will groan beneath the weight of human arrogance, she warned. Storms would multiply, fires would fall from the sky, and the seas would burn with light. She never explained what fire from the sky truly meant. Some say meteors, others solar storms or the explosions of machines orbiting above us. But the symbol is hauntingly familiar today. Cities glowing red under wildfires, skies filled with drones, and satellites blazing trails of metal through space. The heavens themselves have begun to burn. And then came her most unnerving prophecy. The machines will awaken. When she first said those words in the 1980s, no one understood. How could machines awaken? But her voice was calm, certain. She described artificial minds making choices for humanity, steering commerce, war, and even thought. You will not see them, she said, but they will see you. They will think, and you will obey. At the time, it sounded like fantasy. Today, it sounds like tomorrow's news. Artificial intelligence writes, paints, predicts elections, and whispers to every device that listens. It decides what we see, what we fear, what we buy. Baba Vanga's age of machines is no longer distant prophecy. It is the quiet rhythm of our daily lives. She foresaw a moment when humanity would hand over its freedom, not through force, but through convenience. They will beg for comfort, she said, and call it progress. In 2026, she claimed, this illusion would crack. The systems we built to serve us would begin to command us. The same intelligence designed to simplify life would start making choices too vast for human understanding. And humanity, she said, would face its first crisis of control. She did not fear the machines themselves, but what they revealed, that mankind's hunger for creation had surpassed its capacity for conscience. When the servant grows wiser than the master, the house trembles, she warned. To Baba Vanga, technology was never the enemy. It was the mirror. Each new invention reflected humanity's own imbalance between wisdom and desire. The great fracturing, she said, would expose this truth. Nations fighting over power while their own creations quietly rewrote the laws of civilization. And amid that confusion, economic chaos, political division, environmental fury, and artificial minds rising, she said a silence would begin to fall. Not peace, but exhaustion. When every voice shouts, the world will forget how to listen, she whispered. Then the silence will come, and in it, a single word will decide your future, truth or illusion. Look at the world as it stands. The signs are there, like storm clouds forming on a windless day. The dollar trembles. The digital realm hums with secrets. The soil itself shakes. The more connected we become, the more divided we feel. The machines we built to unify us now isolate us in personalized worlds. Perhaps Baba Vanga's age of machines was never just about technology. It was about the mind. The moment when humanity's creations begin to think, not for us, but as us. And so, as 2026 draws near, her prophecy unfolds like a map drawn decades before we could read it. The fractures are visible, between man and machine, truth and illusion, freedom and fear. The question is not whether they exist, but which side of the line we will stand on when the storm arrives. Because the seer warned that when the great fracturing comes, no one will be neutral. Even silence will speak, and even blindness will be a choice. Baba Vanga's voice, they say, would tremble when she spoke of the silence. She called it the stillness before the awakening. Not peace, not calm, but an eerie pause when every system hums too quietly and humanity realizes it has forgotten the sound of its own heartbeat. She said this silence would come after the fractures, after the storms and the rise of machines. It would begin as something invisible, broadcasts flickering, satellites failing, screens going dark one by one. Cities would feel it first, the hum of servers dying, the traffic lights freezing, the endless scroll suddenly still. Then, she said, the world would fall quiet. Not for a minute, not for a day, but long enough for humanity to hear itself again. To those who listened, it sounded like a catastrophe, a global cyber blackout. But Baba Vanga described it differently. She called it the cleansing hush. A pause written into the rhythm of history when humanity would be forced to stop shouting and start remembering. The great silence will divide mankind, she warned, between those who panic and those who prepare. Some scholars think this prophecy mirrors the vulnerability of our modern world. The digital web that holds together economies, governments, and even consciousness itself. A single break, and everything we call civilization flickers like a dying flame. Others read it as spiritual, a symbolic silence, when the illusions of control collapse, and the soul must face the truth without noise to hide behind. It is in this silence, she said, that the red light will rise. The phrase haunted her followers. She never explained it clearly, only whispered, "When the red light shines upon the tower, the path will split in two." Some thought of war, the crimson glow of missiles, the reflection of fire on glass towers. Others saw in it the metaphor of exposure, the red light of cameras, of surveillance, of judgment. But Baba Vanga insisted the red light would not come from destruction. It would come from revelation. She called it the light that burns illusions. Imagine it, the silence after the blackout, then a flare, a red glow on the horizon, pulsing against the sky like a heartbeat. People emerging from darkened homes, staring upward as if the heavens themselves had begun to bleed. She said this would be the moment when the towers of power tremble, not because of bombs, but because of truth revealed. Her words echo strangely in our own time. Leaked documents, whistleblowers, data spilling from the shadows, governments caught in lies, corporations exposed, propaganda unmasked by its own algorithms. Perhaps the red light is already here, flickering on every screen that dares to reveal what lies behind the curtain. In that light, she said, a man shall appear. The man of the red light. A figure both feared and admired, misunderstood, yet pivotal. He would stand in the silence, holding a symbol that divides the world. Some would call him a savior, others a deceiver. She said, he will not command armies, yet nations will move at his words. He will not seek the crown, yet the crown will tremble before him. Was she describing a leader, a whistleblower, a prophet of technology, someone who turns the red light of revelation against those who control it? Or was the man merely a symbol, representing the collective conscience of humankind awakening after centuries of sleep? Baba Vanga left the answer deliberately blurred, as if to remind us that prophecy is a mirror. What you see in it depends on what you bring. But she did reveal one final clue. When the red light falls upon the tower, she said, some will hide, and some will kneel, but a few will walk forward, and they will inherit the dawn. The red light, then, is not destruction, it is choice. The moment humanity decides whether truth is something to fear or to embrace. And in that choice lies the seed of renewal. As she described this revelation, her voice softened. She said the world would awaken not with a roar, but with a whisper. Ordinary people would begin to see patterns they once ignored. They would feel an unease, a knowing that the systems they trusted were built on sand. And out of that unease, small movements would rise, local, humble, unstoppable. People building communities beyond control, finding meaning in the ruins of noise. It is happening already, isn't it? The collapse of faith in the mainstream, the exodus from institutions, the rebirth of self-reliance, independent voices emerging like fireflies in the dark, each one a spark in the great awakening she saw. But Baba Vanga also warned that awakening is painful. The eyes that open after darkness will weep first, she said. Many will mistake exposure for enlightenment, fear for freedom, and chaos for change. The red light will not save all. It will simply reveal. And revelation, she insisted, is never gentle, is still, within that harsh light lies hope. Because after every silence comes a sound, after every revelation, a rebirth. The question is not whether the red light will shine, but whether we will dare to see what it reveals when it does. When Baba Vanga spoke of the end, she never meant annihilation. Her voice would grow calm, almost tender, as if speaking not to warn, but to comfort. The world will not end in fire, she said. It will end in blindness, and begin again in sight. In her final years, she described a vision unlike the destruction that came before. She saw ruins, not of cities, but of illusions. She said America, the eagle she so often invoked, would burn not by invasion, but by revelation. Yet from its ashes, she saw light, a faint golden dawn rising where the towers once cast shadows. When the house burns, she said, it is the warmth that remains that will build anew. She called it the rebirth of the eagle. Not a political revolution, not a victory of one party over another, but a spiritual reformation, a rediscovery of conscience after the long night of confusion. She saw people turning away from the noise, from the constant spectacle of division, and beginning to listen inward again. They would rediscover what she called truth without masters. In her vision, the rebirth began not in palaces or capitals, but in small towns, forgotten valleys, and quiet corners of the digital world. Ordinary men and women, teachers, farmers, builders, healers, would rise, not to overthrow, but to rebuild. They would speak gently, but act with conviction. They would gather around fires and screens, not for entertainment, but for awakening. She said, "They will lead themselves. They will not wait for kings." Perhaps that's already happening. Independent movements spreading across borders, citizens questioning what they once accepted, young voices speaking with ancient clarity. In the chaos of the 2020s, something quieter has been growing, an understanding that the real battle is not left versus right, but truth versus illusion. And yet, Baba Vanga warned, this awakening would come with a price. The blind will lead the blind until one dares to see, she whispered in her final message. But sight is pain before it becomes peace. She foresaw confusion so dense it would feel like fog, truth and lies blending into the same gray. False prophets rising, promising deliverance through rage or technology. They will build towers of light, she said, but their foundations will be made of smoke. She urged humanity to resist the temptation of false saviors, to remember that awakening is not found in spectacle, but in stillness. And then, she spoke of the man of the red light one last time. She said he would not be a destroyer, but a test. He will open the tower, and all will see what they built within. Whether that figure is a leader, a whistleblower, or the symbolic awakening of collective conscience, she left unsaid. What mattered, she said, was the moment after. The silence when humanity must choose what to do with the truth it has seen. In that moment, she saw two paths again. One path of denial, where nations rebuild the same illusions, calling them order. The other path of awareness, where people rebuild the world on a new foundation. One of humility, empathy, and awareness of the unseen. Those who choose the second path, she said, will find light not above them, but within them. As strange as her words may seem, their echo lingers in our own headlines. The rise of artificial intelligence, the erosion of trust, the wars of information, each is both a threat and a mirror. Humanity has built its own Tower of Babel again, and once more it trembles under the weight of its own brilliance. Perhaps the silence she foresaw is not punishment, but mercy, a pause, a divine breath, allowing us to remember who we are beneath the noise. Baba Vanga believed that this era, our era, was not a descent, but a purification. She called it the age of reckoning, when truth would emerge from chaos and the soul of humanity would be weighed, not by gods or kings, but by itself. The final war, she said, will not be fought with weapons, but with truth and deception. Those who cannot tell one from the other will perish, even if they survive. Her final prophecy ends not in despair, but in quiet instruction. Guard not gold, but integrity. Build not walls, but bonds. Seek not power, but clarity. She believed America, the great mirror of the world, would lead this awakening once more, not through dominance, but through rediscovery. From its ashes, she said, would rise a nation of light, not of law. A people bound not by borders, but by a shared hunger for truth. And as 2026 approaches, her question hangs like a whisper through the storm. Will we recognize the prophecy when it unfolds before our eyes? Perhaps the red light is already upon the tower. Perhaps the silence has already begun. The screens dim, the noise fades, and in the hush between fear and faith, something ancient stirs. The light will not save all, only those who see it. But maybe, just maybe, that light has already found you.